Welcome to another episode of the Appraisal Doctor. I am Dr. Aria A. Wilson, PhD in Urban Planning, Certified Residential Appraiser. If you are joining us here for the first time, welcome. And if you're a regular subscriber, welcome back. Stick around and let's see what the question is. The question that we're going to be looking at today is, what is the difference between an assessed value and the market value? Are they the same? How do we arrive at each? Let's get into it. Let's first define the assessed value. Now, assessed value is basically the value on which a county or the city, or depending on the jurisdiction that you're in, the county appraisal district is apportioning taxes, property taxes. Now the property taxes are levied on a particular value, and that value is called the assessed value. It's called the assessed value purely on the basis that that's the value that property taxes will be based on. The market value, which is a definition that we have visited before on this channel, is basically the value that there is an intersection between the desire for property, the demand, and the supply. So like in economics, wherever the cross section is, wherever the two meet, equals the price, which equates to the market value. So market value basically is based on market behavior. Is the assessed value also based on market behavior? It can be, but not all the time. Now, let's look at the assessed value and what is taken into consideration when it's being arrived at by an appraiser. Is this an engagement that an appraiser can get? Absolutely. And this is one of the scenarios where the value might be based on the assessment for a particular tax year. So for example, I could be approached with an engagement that requests an assessed value for a residential property for the year 2020, a year in the past, because there might be a situation where the property owner is protesting the value that his property taxes are based on. So the assessed value can be based on market. It can also be based on other approaches to value. Now, this video is not about what are the approaches to value, but we will touch on it just a little bit. Now, if the county assessor arrives at a value, an assessed value of a particular number, it is usually based on a particular approach to value. For example, in a residential scenario, usually residential properties, their values are based on the market, right? The interaction of demand and supply. How many people want to buy the property? How many properties are there for sale? That value is usually the market value. And in the residential scenario, that market value is usually what the county assessor tries to base his value on. So the approach that would be taken to arrive at value, the assessed value, would be the sales approach. Looking for sales comps, looking for comps that are particularly similar to the subject property. And this is assuming that we are staying within the time frame that the appraisal is for. So if the assessed value is being sought or being arrived at for 2020, we are looking at sales transactions for 2020, assuming we're in a residential scenario. If we're in a commercial scenario, however, a commercial scenario of retail versus office, the approach can be different. Now, if in a perfect world, an appraisal is being done for market value for a commercial property that has income coming in, that approach to value would be the income approach. So basically, even though it's a market value that we're going to be arriving at for that commercial property, we're going to arrive at it with a different approach to value, which is the income approach, because income is being earned on the property. So the value is going to be heavily weighted on the income. The county assessor is going to attempt to do the same thing, base their value using the same approach an appraiser would use in the open market for a market value appraisal. So there you have some similarities. The approaches to value are usually attached to the type of property. So for example, in a residential scenario, if you're doing a residential appraisal and it's not in an urban area where there are a lot of transactions, many people are buying homes, then you might run into the problem of not finding enough sales comparisons, sales comparables. There are no comps because there have perhaps been no transaction in the past year. It could be in a suburb or in a rural residential vicinity where there are not a lot of transactions. People buy their homes or they buy land and build their homes and they're not intending to resell. So there are not a lot of transactions in the market to support what a market value would be. In that scenario, the appraiser now has to look at other approaches. And in this case, the cost approach would be the next best approach in a residential scenario that does not provide sales transactions. The same predicament will reach the county assessor, the county appraiser. They would now have to look to a cost approach. How much does it cost to build a property like this? How many years has it been out? Should there be depreciation? How much percentage depreciation should there be on this property? So that's the cost approach. And the cost approach would be applicable in a market scenario and also an assessed value scenario because there is a limitation of no comparable sales in the market. So are there similarities to come by an assessed value versus a market value? Oh yes. Where does it come different? It becomes different where if an appraiser is tasked with finding an assessed value, it is prudent of that appraiser to look at the approach that the assessor has taken. I am assuming that the appraiser is asked to perform an appraisal for assessed value on the basis that the property owner is not satisfied with the value that was placed on his property by the county. I am speaking squarely in the scenario of a property value protest. It is fine to use several approaches in one appraisal, by the way. If an appraiser goes ahead to do an appraisal for assessed value, the approach that is taken generally to an appraisal, especially if it's residential, it's the market approach. So the first step is to look for sales. Now, if you can find sales that are supportive of a value, then you can use the sales approach. If the sales approach comes up with a value that is in favor of a reduction in the value that the assessor has given the property owner, then great for the property owner. If the appraisal using comps comes up with a value that is higher than the assessor's value, then the property owner is in trouble. It means that the appraisal is not supportive of his position. And the appraiser can do nothing about it because in the open market, the value is higher than the assessed value. In that scenario, it would be advised for the property owner to walk away from such a protest or use another approach to protest. So let's summarize what we just spoke about. If the the appraiser is given a task to find the assessed value of a property, it is prudent that with residential, he or she is going to use the sales comparable approach. If the residential property is not within an urban area or an area that has transactions that can be used to support a value, then the cost approach is the next best step. It is assumed that the assessor would have taken the same approach, sales, and if the sales approach is not supportive of coming up with any value, then the cost approach. Now, if I am doing an independent appraisal of that property, it is prudent that I go with the approach, I reconcile with the approach that the district assessor has reconciled with, especially if the approach is one that is the regular approach. Now, if you go ahead and you are looking for sales and you find sales and you're wondering why the district used a cost approach, you can just go right ahead and fight. Yes, you're using a different approach, but you can also do a cost approach and go in with two approaches so that you have more basis on which to show that there is truth in the value being that number. It is not the appraiser's job to try to get a value that is lower than the assessor's. It is the appraiser's job to find the true value of the property, despite being used in an assessed value protest scenario. What is the difference between the processes of finding the assessed value versus the market value? And I would say the difference is it is not always based on the sales comparison approach in the residential scenario. In the commercial scenario, the values are normally arrived at through the income approach, and the same should go for the county assessor. However, it is not always the same value that is arrived at. So, in a perfect world, there would be similarities. In a perfect world, they ought to be the same. But unfortunately, they are not always the same. It is believed by some property owners that the county tries to find the approach that gives them the highest value so that they can gain more property taxes. That's not something that can be proven, but that's a theory that exists. At the end of the day, the appraiser needs to stay focused on the facts surrounding the evidence that's supporting an assessed value. And that assessed value, if it's supposed to be on the sales approach, the appraiser needs to do his job, do an objective analysis, and come up with whatever value is fair. The property owner takes that appraisal and he or she can decide whether or not it is helpful in a tax protest situation. Thank you so much for joining us today on the Appraisal Doctor, and I hope I have answered your question on this topic. Ask me questions in the comment section and I can tailor the next Appraisal Doctor presentation on clearing up any issues that may have arisen. This topic is one that is very, very concerning for many property owners in the state of Texas for sure. And I am happy to answer any of the concerns that you may have within my capability. Thank you so much for joining us today, and see you on the next episode of the Appraisal Doctor.